Welcome everyone to another CTC software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis and I'm the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software. And in today's session, we get to continue on the CTC Nexus Automation API series that we're working on. We're here in part number 3. Now, as always, of course, these webinars are recorded, so certainly you can review these later on our YouTube channel as well. So when you're trying to leverage this yourself and you want a refresher, this might be a great thing to come back to. Also, as always, for those of you who are participating with us live in this webinar, we try to keep our eyes on that questions and answers window. So please feel free to throw questions in there and I will try to answer them in line with the presentation for those of you who are live again, if it's relevant to what I'm talking about at the moment, or we do save a large QA session for the end. All right, without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about today's kind of topic here. So we've been in the middle of a series, and in this one, we're going to talk a lot about making better use of the Nexus Suite's project activity logs. I know a number of you on the Revit front, you've been like, hey, I love this, but I want an easier way to work with my projects, creating them and associating data with them. And so in this part 3 of this series, we're going to take a look at how the Automation API can really be your key to managing that organization a whole heck of a lot better. We're going to dive into creating projects, talk about efficiently categorizing and managing models and logging in the log information and kind of partnering that a little bit with some of the reporting API. All of that is going to be a part of today's presentation. Let's talk about, we're going to cover it really in depth here, getting base data, creating and updating, deleting projects and project paths for that matter, and managing user and group permissions within this environment. We're going to go through the different endpoints that are relevant for it. And again, as always, I like to talk about where we are in this series. Once again, this is part 3. So we've already talked about comprehensive introduction to this. We've talked about using the accounts portion of this API to automate the creation of users and groups, to manage those users in those groups. And in this session, we're going to be focusing exclusively on the projects. Next time, we'll be focusing on the CMS content aspect. Much bigger presentation that time. Let's recap a little bit about the prerequisites here and talk about what you need to have in place to be able to leverage this as effectively as is possible. Okay, because there are some prerequisites that are important. We want to make sure that you know what they are. So prerequisite number 1, of course, you have to have a CTC portal sign-on. You can get that from ctcsoftware.com/portal. If you're using CTC licensing, if you're using the Nexus Suite, chances are you probably already have that. But just in case you don't, we wanted to make sure you're aware you will need a CTC authentication to be able to get access to a lot of this information. Okay. Number 2, you need to have an automation access key. And you can request that key from license request at ctcsoftware.com. If you have a CTC account, you can get this key. You can get it for both the automation aspect and for the reporting aspect. They are 2 separate keys by design. And today you're going to actually see a little bit of why that is super critical, why you need to have separate keys. You will want to establish for yourself a Postman account because it's easier to review this API and kind of dabble with and play with the data, understand how it's coming through and what you need to do to interact with it before you start coding. And then also, as a part of today's whole presentation, we recommend that you use this information to plan your automation and your integration for all of your internal workflows that are going to relate to this. There's a lot of power here. You can do quite a lot with this data. And by kind of planning ahead a little bit and seeing what this can do for you, you know, it'll really save a lot of headache and trouble in the future if you've got a plan to start with. Don't just start coding and expect things to work out. Start with a plan, right? That's kind of key. Okay, let's do some discussion here about how you get data. We're going to start with a little bit of essentials, kind of a little bit of a review from last time. But in this one, we're going to talk about the projects API and sort of its essentials. So this is a REST API. REST is a system in programming space that allows you to communicate to a service via some specific calls. In our case, we're accessing this via a URL, and the URL for this in the projects space is using the scope of projects. So it's HTTPS API ctcsoftware.com/automation/projects. This scope here, last time it was accounts, and this is the version 1 of the automation API. Now, in this presentation today, I'm going to be using API stage. So where you see API here, I'll be using API-stage because I'm going to be doing a lot of creation, deletion, and I don't want to risk deleting something in production that the rest of my team needs for demonstrations later on today. So I'll be doing all of this work in a staging space. There are specific routes that you'll take for different actions, i.e. there's projects, there's project, there's project paths, there's others that are in here. And I'll show some of these off to you as we're kind of going through the presentation today so you can understand. And those different routes, which I actually often call in my code collections, it's the same thing, but they kind of tack on to the end of automation here. So automation/projects or /project or project paths. And that gives the system an understanding of what you're about to try to do. Are you trying to get all projects or just data about a specific project if you want more details, for example? This helps you kind of do that. And you manage all of this with code. All of these routes require an organization access key. This is where that key that I mentioned in the previous slide, where this comes into play. You have to have a valid access key or automation key for this to actually do anything at all. So if you just try to go to this route in your web browser right now, it's going to do nothing for you because you won't have an access key that you're putting in there unless you've already requested one from us. And of course, you can do that, of course. So let's talk about getting some data. Let's just talk about the early get of data. And I'm going to focus this little portion here on the get request for projects. And actually, before I get too far into this, actually, no, let's just go through this slide and then we'll kind of dig into Postman a little bit and take a look at what this means. So with the get request for projects, there are often with get requests some input parameters. In this case, with the get request for projects, there is access key, right? That's one of the fields that is required. This is required on pretty much every one of the endpoints. I just mentioned that, right? The access key, that GUID, that access key unique identifier for you, for your automation key, that's going to be required for pretty much every request. Get, put, doesn't matter, whatever they are, it's going to be required. This one here has some extra ones, like a query. You can ask for specific kinds of information and filter down the projects. Maybe you're looking for just a certain project number. You can filter for that, or a certain series of project numbers with certain prefixes, or certain names of a project. You can query for just that. If you leave that blank, and you absolutely can, just don't include it, it will give you all projects back. You can ask for a particular page number. This thing has a limit on page size of a max of 100. So as you create additional items in there over time, you're going to have probably more than 100 projects in the system. And as that happens, you'll have to page through and ask for additional pages. So this lets you ask for a certain page. What I often do is I ask for page 1 and a page size of 1. You'll see in a minute that there's a certain header that comes back that tells you how many total items you have. And you can then use that in the math to figure out like how many times do you have to make this request and what page you're on. So you can actually, with code, do this automatically, fairly easily actually. You can also choose how you want to sort the data. So if you're querying for a specific collection of something that matches hospital, for example, or medical, or whatever the case might be, clinic, it doesn't matter. You sort by something, then, or you query for something, you can sort by something like project number, or maybe the project name, or there's other fields you can sort by as well. And you can also say sort descending, true or false. So you can have an ability to control which order, which direction that sorting actually takes place. Now, when you send this GET request, you're going to get a response back. And that response, the GET response for projects specifically, looks something like this. This is JSON code. And it's just a JSON standardized format here. And it has basically these little curly braces beginning and end. It tells you within those curly braces, that curly braces basically means there's going to be multiple collections of things you're going to get back. Like there's a property that's called total items. And within total items, it gives you a value back, 24 total items in my case. There is going to be, after that, a comma and the items themselves. So within there, total items 24. If I only asked for one, I would only get one of the 24 on that particular page. But Within the items themselves, then there's this little square bracket, which typically indicates a list of objects. And within that list of objects, oops, I clicked instead of meaning to just point, you get another set of curly braces, which is a set of properties inside of there, like project ID, project number, project name, and they're going to all have their respective values. It closes off the curly brace and goes on to the next project, giving you the next collection of data if you've asked for more than one. So that's kind of how a response body works. I'm going to give you a bit of a different example here. I'm going to use Postman for this. And in my Postman environment, I've actually had all this stuff expanded out. I'm going to focus for right now on just the projects automation version 1, the get request here. And you can see there's this this full path up here on top. I have a few parameters in there in sort of the orange coloring. You can see that I'm only supplying it an access key. I'm not including any of those other available things that I could filter by if I wanted to. And when I sent this, it goes and asks the system for what is available, and then it returns back to me a result once it has communicated with that system, assuming I have everything set up in here correctly and nothing is super angry. While that's waiting to come back here, I can also expand out this little sort of birdmouth/birdmouth option over here, and it'll actually show you what exactly it's doing. It's basically just a web address in this case, because of how this is asking for the information, and it's sending this information off to the system to get a response back. And that response comes back, and actually, I guess I made a project recently, so I'm gonna have 25 in this list, and it lists out, as I mentioned, those items with the item body here, which gives me the project ID, number, name, and what kind of access level the account that's looking at this has for the data here. And because you're in the Automation API, this access level will always say manager, so I just throw it away because it doesn't matter. I care most about the ID, number, and name. So that's the response body that you're going to get back. Now, you can also go one step further and get a bunch more information about the projects. You can get the project details. Now, this one has a slightly different kind of request that you're going to be sending. It's still a GET request, so same thing, but we're going specifically to the collection that is the project collection. So we're targeting a specific project, not all projects in this case. And it has some input parameters that are needed for it. In fact, both of these particular input parameters are required. One is the access key, which again is going to always be there for everything that you send in our API. And the other one is a project ID, which is also a GUID, and it's also required. And this will then send you back some kind of a response body, the GET response, and it's going to look like this. So this one doesn't have a total number of items because you're only asking for one thing anyway. Instead, it just sends you the full details about that project with that particular ID. You're going to see some repeat data like the ID and the project number and project name, but you're also going to see if it's active and what office and what, all the other information, what due date it has. All this information will be there in this GET response. So an example of that, if I was to pull Postman forward, let's go pick that project that I was just looking at here, the CTC Office project. I'm going to copy this project ID. I'm going to go into project and use the GET request for the project and tell it that particular project ID, and I'll send that along. So this is going to go ask the system for all of the details available for this particular project. You can see I've got the ID, the number, the name, if it's active or not, because you can actually disable a project and have it not show up on your main panel in the CTC portal. What organization name and description you're using this for, the office, the building, perhaps a specific client name. You can use it however you want, the address, like there's a lot of information available here. And then also what kind of permissions are associated to this particular project, both user permissions and group permissions, if there are any. And you can see, what the resource ID is, which group it is, and what kind of role it has for permissions on that particular project, right? So it gives you all of the detail for that one particular project itself. So here's the deal. I don't necessarily want to be using this Postman environment all the time. This is not the most efficient way of viewing this kind of information. Instead, what I'm going to do, the way that I'm going to demonstrate this to you, is I'm going to use Excel. And the way that I've written this in Excel is I've told it to go fetch all of my projects, and I've gone through every single page that's available to me. It actually intelligently says, how many do you have in the list? What's the total number of items? And then it goes and fetches all of them. And then for each project that it finds, it goes and fetches the details and fills out an Excel spreadsheet with all of those details. So let's go see this in action. If I open up my Excel file, which apparently I actually had closed, so we're going to open this up completely from scratch in Excel. This is an XLSM, you can see here, a macro-enabled Excel workbook, so you will have to have macros available and turned on. I have built myself a series of tabs up here. One of them is the CTC settings tab, and you saw this last time in part 2 where I can put in my access key. And you already saw a lot of this on the accounts tab where I can get groups and get users and create and update users and groups and things. Now we're going to be focusing on the projects tab here. You might notice I'm on the accounts groups org tab right now, but when I click get projects, this is going to go fetch all of the projects, and then it's going to go fetch all of the project details, and then it's going to display that to me on the PAL projects tab. So it actually throws me onto this tab and fills it out with all of the available information that is here. I've now got a full list of all of my data in Excel fully filled out, and I can now begin my next step, which is manipulating this information. So I'm doing this from Excel. You might do this in a different environment. That's totally fine. I'm just showing you one example again of how you could do some of this work. Okay, so that's that response body coming back, and I'm now formatting that into an Excel space. So let's talk about the next step here, which is creating or updating projects. And actually, it's a single project. So for this creating and updating, what we're doing is we're using the put, and actually I put a delete here, but this should just be put, the put request for a project specifically. Now with that put request, there's some parameters. There's the access key, of course, because you have to have that. There is a header that you have to send along, which tells it you're actually working with JSON data. You're providing it JSON data, and you're expecting JSON data back. And then you're going to be providing a body. This body here is a curly braces, sort of like the data you get back from the get project request. You're going to be putting a body like that right back inside of there with the same exact parameters available. In my case, I'm only using 3 here, like an ID, a project name, a project number. You can put any of those fields back, any of them that you get with the get request. And then that will create that project. So an example here in the Postman space, if I go back to here, if I go to the put, and I go to the parameters area, again, there's just the access key, which I'm pushing my automations access key here. You can see that over here with the little put portion, this web address. This is specifically a put request in this case, but you can see that I have a whole body worth of data that can be pushed into the system. There's a little template body here so you can see what all the parameters and properties are expected to be. And you can include or exclude any of these. If you include an ID, then it's going to be updating a project. If you exclude the ID and you just provide this other stuff, then it will be creating a project. So you can either update with an ID included or create with the ID excluded. Now, if you create, you have to have a project name at least and a project number. Those 2 fields are pretty much required. If you are updating, you have to at least have the ID provided so it knows which project to update. So, and it does a little bit of checking for that in my logic that I wrote in my Excel space. So let's just do a quick example of this. If I go into Excel and I'm like, hey, I want a new project here. Let's test the project create. Then what I can do with that is hit create project, and it'll actually call the create command, and it pushes this data in. And when it's done, it tells me it's complete, and you'll see that it fills itself out with the ID that was auto-generated in the system. So I just generated a project. And then later on, if I'm like, well, I want this to be, all of this data over here, I want to actually have that in that project, I could simply say update that project. And now what it will do is it will push that new data and tells me it's complete and refreshes this page as well. Doesn't really need to refresh the page because I've already got it, but that's fine. It has it. But I can do things like editing existing projects or creating a whole bunch of stuff here and maybe filling all of them out with some specific data. Maybe I want this to be Office 0, and I want to have that just sort of like auto-fill down, create a bunch of these things here. So for all these projects, I'm going to either create or update, and it'll actually intelligently know the way that I have this to do one or the other, but it's going to go ahead and push into the system all of that data, right? So it's complete, it's got that. And technically right now, if I was to go to the portal, all of these projects now exist. So for those of you who are like, well, I need to be able to automate this creation, I don't want to do it one by one by one, and your upload of an Excel file was kind of frustrating, well, this automations toolkit now, I can simply fill out an Excel spreadsheet and tell it to update, to push, and it will do that. So that can be done. Now you can also do a similar deal with the delete. The delete call is a little different. All it really wants is the ID. It's actually a delete call. There's no body. It just takes the ID as a parameter. I could take and delete all 5 of these if I really wanted to right now. Just call the delete project, because the way that I wrote this, it takes each individual row, it calls each one recursively that I have selected, and it deletes those particular projects out of the system. They're all gone now. They've been all deleted. In fact, I can delete this other test here as well. So I could do just one, and it will automatically delete that. And so I've now just cleaned up my projects environment, and it's all good. Now, if there was any data associated to those projects via project paths that have been logged already from the project activity logger, I'm not deleting the data with this. I'm simply deleting the bundle, the project collection that held some of that information sort of in a little group of data. But, and yeah, so there's nothing really lost by just deleting a project other than the pre-grouping of some stuff. Now, one of the other things you can do also is managing project path associations. And from this point forward, just to save some time, I'm not going to continue the demonstration in the Excel space. We're just going to kind of talk through how this data comes back. So we're going to be going and getting project paths here. This is another get request, specifically targeting the project paths collection or resource inside of there. There are 2 input parameters for this. There's access key, which of course is always required, and there's project ID. And then within the header, you can include a header if you want to. You don't necessarily have to, but then you're going to get back a response from this that tells you the total number of items that exist in that request. And then within that, the actual items themselves, which gives you, all the properties here about the project path. So it'll give you the ID of the path, the project number it's associated to, if anything, and the central file path that is related to that particular path. So you could do things like asking for all the project paths that don't have a project number, and then taking all those paths, reading through them, and associating them with a particular project. So the next time you do this GET request, it actually associates with a project, right? There's a lot of strategies you could do with that. So this is the GET response. Lets me get that information. Then the update response, or the update path here for project paths, is similar. It's a put request, in this case for project paths. You are going to have an input parameter of your access key and the project ID that you're going to be associating all of the paths to, the header as content type, and then you're also going to be including here a body. And that body is the project path ID. And if you're creating a new path, when you're doing this association, you can also associate a central file path with it. So then it will create the central file path, it will build the project path ID, or you can supply one, and it will associate that with the actual project ID that you've specified over here. So you can actually associate a bunch of paths with projects very quickly in an automated way. So with all of that you have so far, I want to talk about a little strategy that you could use. So if you're kind of writing down some notes, future planning this out, if you're trying to use the PAL system, what you could do is within your timekeeping product that you use for your office. A lot of my customers leverage Deltek Vision for this. Some might use other ones. But within your timekeeping app, there is an API that it has. It can tell you when you're making a new project. It can have some actions it does after the fact. One of those actions might be to call the CTC Automation API, and you could create a project that has all the exact same properties that you just put into the Deltek Vision project. So when you make your project in Deltek, it could automatically be making that same exact project inside the CTC environment. Now, if you guys have a really well standardized project path standard in the office, or a BIM 360 or Autodesk Construction Cloud path process that you have and file naming process that you have, you could automatically at that same time turn right around and use this update project paths to actually create or update project paths. Tell it, what the central file paths are that you want associated. You'll know what the project ID is because you can get that back immediately after creation, and associate a whole bunch of central file paths that are relevant to that particular project, or that might be used if you have some variations within your firm, and all those paths could be pre-built and pre-associated. And then what will happen is, as soon as users begin to create models in the Revit space, those model paths will log to the system via PAL, via the project activity logger, and because you've already built the project and you've already associated those paths, they immediately begin to drop into the bucket of that project. And you don't have to do anything extra than have built the project in Deltek Vision, something you're already doing. And if you build this automation workflow, it's already built into the CTC Nexus PAL environment as well because of this automations API. So a lot of power there, a lot of power. A lot of automatic work that can then make your reporting aspect of this a whole lot easier. Now, there's more to this than just the updating of project paths. There is technically the ability to delete project paths. The delete project paths allows the input parameters of access key and a project path ID. Now, this one here, I want you to be very, very careful. This delete project paths, actually destroys data. It deletes data from the CTC environment, and there is no recovery from it when you do this. What it will do is actually delete the path, and it deletes all records that were stored with that path. I've had some customers who have certain projects that may have gone up there into the CTC environment. Maybe they didn't want them to go up, or maybe they're just junk. People save stuff to their C drive, and if it's a work sharing enabled project, you get a bunch of extra noise in the environment, and maybe you want to delete those. So you can. With this, you can actually delete the project path, which deletes all of its data records as well. But do be careful. If you delete real project paths from the environment that are actually in use, you will lose the data and it will be gone from your reporting as well. This is why, one of the major reasons why I strongly recommend, keeping this automations access key a bit private, right? Like, only put this in the hands of really good users. Don't just willy-nilly throw this Excel file out to the masses and let people just do stuff with an Excel file, because if that delete button's there and they delete paths, they could be destroying data, right? That's why it's separate from reporting. Reporting is safe. It just gets data. It doesn't push anything back in. This actually pushes data back in, and it could be a problem. You can also potentially manage project permissions, and this is project permissions for viewing within the portal. So this has its own put request. You can already get the permissions with the project details. You saw some of those details earlier for group and user permissions, but you can put this in there. This actually completely replaces the project permissions. This isn't an additive thing. It is a replacing thing. It has an access key as an input parameter, of course. It has project ID for this, of course. It does require the header of content type, and that is because there is a body that you're pushing back in. And whatever you include here is what the permissions will be. Again, it's a replacement set of permissions. So if you want to completely replace the group permissions with a particular group, great. You can just push that, just the group, and you're good to go. If you want to push with just a specific user, you could do that, or a combination of the two. Once again, I do always recommend that you go take a look at the API here in Postman. This is the best way to take a look at it, because you can see what the structure is supposed to be. Users with a list of users with their properties, the resource ID and the role that you want, or groups with, again, resource ID, the group ID, and the role that you want them to have. And if you're like, well, Sean, what are the roles? Well, the roles are actually in here as well. The project roles are available, and it's really only two. It's 1 for a viewer and 100 for a manager, or if you don't assign any role, they have no ability to view or manage that particular project. So, and that's all focusing on the portal aspect, so people can see that data in the portal and in the portal reporting in the stock dashboards. This does nothing whatsoever for using the reporting API, say in Excel or Power BI for yourselves. That kind of circumvents these rights. This is all about portal specific rights on the ctcsoftware.com portal. Okay, so there's a lot of power that's available here in the Projects API. There's a lot you can do with this. You can create, edit, update, delete, manage all of this information very quickly by using Excel or whatever automation tools you want. I want to remind you of one more thing. Within these APIs, of course, because it's an API, a programming interface, it's language agnostic. So if you all want to do this with Dynamo, have fun. I did all of my demo today in VBA and a little bit of Power Query. And you could use Python, or you could use C#, or you could use Lisp. I don't care. It doesn't matter as long as you can communicate out to the REST API and put or get or delete or post. You can do all the things you need to do within the projects and users and groups APIs that we talked about so far. So where are we so far? We just talked today about using the Projects API. That's what we kind of focused on in this session. Next session, we're going to talk about using the CMS API, where we can do a lot of other fun things like creating libraries, creating tags, associating tags and libraries with content, disassociating tags and libraries with content, deleting versions of content, all kinds of stuff we'll be able to do with this. And again, I'm going to use the Excel interface to do a lot of this stuff, but you could use whatever you want for your automations. So with that, for those of you watching this as a recording up on YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope you found this very valuable and meaningful, and that you can use this in your own planning and reporting. We also hope this kind of earns a like and maybe a subscription from you as well.